critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, hello and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. As always, here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat in these troubled times in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth. Our mission is to inform, educate and entertain, but with dignity and respect. And it's vital that we don't just ask the questions, but question the answers. Well, today we're going to be focusing again on the Middle East crisis. Tensions have risen over the last week following the assassination of Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, for which Iran has vowed severe retaliation. And today on the Muckrakers, it's made up of myself, Andrew Eborn, but also Richard Pater, Martin Jay and Dr. George Szamuely. I know Richard's joining us. Let me tell you about him. He's basically had over 15 years experience working alongside government officials, diplomats and journalists. He regularly briefs British audiences on Israeli politics and security issues. He's also a director of BICOM, which is the British Israel Communication and Research Centre, which is an independent British research centre. And they produce analysis, insight and commentary to promote a greater understanding of Israel and the Middle East in the UK. So we look forward to that. He's also responsible for delegations which BICOM bring to Israel, and he joined them from the Israeli Prime Minister's office, where he spearheaded the engagement with the foreign press. Following the Second Lebanon War, Richard received the Prime Minister's Prize for Excellence. I'm sure he'll tell us about that. And Richard served in the IDF Armoured Brigade, where he twice received commendations and continues to serve in the reserves. He also holds a BA in Philosophy and Politics from Manchester University. Martin Jay, an award-winning journalist, editor of margremi.org and that very important news site levantis.me. His career has spanned over 30 years, which has seen him work in over 50 countries for a host of big media titles. My favourite bit, however, is on his Twitter X page. He proudly proclaims he's been fired by all the media giants, and CNN called him a good journalist, but a pain in the back side. And finally today, Dr. George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute London. He's written for innumerable publications and is author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. Gentlemen, hello and thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you again, Andrew.
Very good. I think we're going to have Richard. Maybe we'll start with some of the others and so on and so forth. Let me first of all talk about the breaking news with sources familiar with the White House's thought process. The Washington Post, it states that Israel informed the United States immediately following the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh that it was behind the killing. Biden administration apparently were reportedly livid about the decision to take out Haniyeh, worrying it could upend months of careful negotiations towards a truce in Gaza. And obviously that was the thing. I think Richard's joined us now. How are you, Richard?
Good afternoon. Nice to be with you all.
It's nice to be with you all. I don't know if you heard that beginning. We were just talking about the taking out of Haniyeh, who was the chief negotiator, if you like, for this path to peace, and the reaction from the Biden administration that they were livid that he was taken out. Let me get your take on it. What are your views?
Well, first of all, I don't think he was that responsible in terms of the negotiations. I think he was helping facilitating that process. But I think even beforehand, the buck really stopped with the Hamas leadership inside Gaza and primarily with Sinwar. And as we've now seen the announcement in the last 24 hours that Sinwar is not only remaining in charge of the faction inside Gaza, but of the overall operation and replacing him, I think that's more proof of that he's really the one calling the shots.
But in terms of taking out the optics on it, if he was at least part of the peace negotiation, why do you think they took him out?
It's a good question. I mean, first of all, Israel formally hasn't taken responsibility, so we're in it's the assumption, but I'm sure that we all share. I think since October the 7th, I think the Israelis have said that all the Hamas leadership are marked men, as it were. And an operation opportunity presented itself, which they took. I don't think that would be my kind of my reading of it on face value.
Okay, George.
Well, I think Richard probably sums it up rather well. I mean, I think Israel's mode is just simply to target all Hamas leaders. The problem is, of course, that doesn't really address the problem. I mean, even if you wiped out Sinwar and the rest of the Hamas leaders, there are going to be other leaders to take their place. So that's why essentially the policy of targeted assassinations is actually of very limited utility, because there's always somebody else ready to take his place. And that's why states generally don't do it. They fight wars, try to win wars, and resolve issues through peace negotiations. But taking out the leaders of your opponents is really quite a pointless activity.
Martin?
Pointless, and I think one which may well backfire on Israel. I don't think you can have your cake and eat it. I don't think you can say on the one hand, look, this guy wasn't that important, but he was a sitting duck in Iran, and we had some double agents inside, working for the Iranian Guard who helped two ladies. It was a very, very detailed, precise, very well executed operation as far as assassinations go. But I think it's going to be very, very hard now for Israel to face the international community and keep a straight face and say we're happy to carry on talking about the possibility of a peace process when there is no peace process. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that Israel is not interested in a two-state solution. Israel is not interested in stopping its killing, its murdering of women and children at this incredible rate. And I think it's just rank hypocrisy to talk about such things in a certain light. Either the guy was important and relevant and worth assassinating, or he wasn't. I'm not sure I swallow completely the explanation of that.
Well, I mean, he certainly was. He was the leader of Hamas, and he was basically recognized by a number of people as key to the negotiations for peace. Richard, I'll let you come back on that. What are your takes on what Martin and George have to say?
Oh, I mean, first of all, I'd make a distinction. I don't think these weren't peace talks. These are talks to reach a hostage release and a ceasefire. Very specific technical framework. I mean, we can talk broadly if we want to talk about peace process. Unfortunately, that's nowhere near. But Hamas weren't anywhere on the cards in terms of a real peace process, and I think
you're splitting hairs. I think perfectly well. I meant a ceasefire, obviously not peace talks for a complete solution of the Middle East. I mean, I was referring to a ceasefire, and I stand by my point. I can't see how Israel can now keep a straight face and say it's committed to any sort of ceasefire when it's carrying out these assassinations.
There are lots of blocks and potential problems to reach a ceasefire, and I think the part of the issue as well is that whether Israel just doesn't see Hamas as a partner at all. The very fact that these talks are presuming that there will be stages 2 and 3 that will see Hamas remain in some form of control is incredibly problematic, not just for Israel but for the international community and for the goodwill that looks to rebuild Gaza the day after. No one is going to want to invest in Gaza whilst Hamas is still in control there. So it's we're really caught in a very difficult and dangerous dilemma as there's no obvious way forward there.
You mentioned part of your role, Richard, is obviously to assist people's understanding of Israel and its position. Now, my understanding from talking to a number of people and reading various publications is that a lot of people in Israel don't support Netanyahu's approach. What's the truth?
Absolutely. Listen, Israel is quite divided right now. The Netanyahu, to an extent, is a litmus test. That he still has a section of support. I bear in mind that even those that are kind of because of the Israeli electoral system, Netanyahu is in power thanks to about 25% of the support, and that number has been pretty consistent throughout his time as prime minister. And then his reliance on coalition partners. This time round, those coalition partners are of the hard right and the ultra orthodox that are bringing together, that have a vested interest in seeing Netanyahu remain in power. And just like the IDF themselves are rehabilitating their image within Israeli society following the failure of October the 7th. Similarly, Netanyahu is also trying to rehabilitate his own image as a leader, and as he potentially looks to fight the next election. But you're absolutely right. There is at least 50% of the country that is vehemently against him, that is kind of is of a much more, I would say, a liberal democratic hue, and that sees a different way forward, and sees Netanyahu for his collective almost decade and a half in power as ultimately responsible for the failures on October the 7th, and so he must go. But as a functioning democracy, albeit with its problems and challenges, that will be left to the electorate eventually.
Yeah, and I think it's so important in this discussion, as I say, we always like to shine more light and less heat on this, because so many people, they just assume that everybody's behind Netanyahu, and as you rightly say, that's not the case at all. George, what's your thought?
Well, I'd be interested to find out from Richard that, okay, so let's say 50% of the population does not support Netanyahu, but from what I've understood from the opinion poll surveys, they may not like him, they may not like his government, but they do support his war aims, and they do support his pursuit of the war to the finish. In other words, that ultimate nebulous goal of destroying Hamas, which seems to be a very, very difficult and a dubious exercise. So I want to know from Richard, so when you say 50% don't support Netanyahu, don't like Netanyahu, that's a given. But what's the percentage of the population that would now settle for a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities now, today?
Richard?
So I'll just give an example. I mean, if you go to Tel Aviv on a Saturday night, you see 3 protests happening kind of on parallel streets simultaneously. One is calling for the release of the hostages, the other is calling for an end of the war, and the other is calling for the end of this government. So how to group those 3 together is kind of where three factors of the opposition now stand. I think the significant single issue which divides Netanyahu supporters from those against is that the critique that Netanyahu is unprepared to talk about the day after, something I alluded to earlier, that a lot of people understand that beyond the military campaign, there needs to be some form of political process then put in place. And for a lot of people, the Palestinian Authority, which has plenty of problems and faults and deficiencies of its own, is for many people the only game in town. And the understanding is that alongside Israel's regional partners, primarily the Egyptians and the Jordanians, the Emiratis as well, have a vested interest in that political process, but will see the removal of Hamas and a different Palestinian leadership being able to take control in the Gaza Strip.
Martin?
Well, is it really, Richard, is it really the removal of Hamas we're talking about here, or is it really the removal of all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip?
Oh no! I'm quite sure that for the vast majority of Israelis, we are talking about the former. Even Netanyahu himself has kind of pushed up against. I mean, the hard right in Israel that is talking about resettlement of the Gaza Strip is nowhere near the consensus, even amongst Netanyahu supporters and Likud voters. And Netanyahu has made it clear that's not the agenda. And he's also even gone as far to say, it's not his agenda for the IDF to remain there on a permanent basis. He wants to, as you said before, kind of to have his cake and eat it, and kind of for the Israel to remain in control, to have this kind of amorphous vacuum there, and that's not constructive. And so the question is, who is Israelis, as the majority of them, do not want to be taking control of Gazan sewage and civil society and healthcare, education, housing, etc. That's not on the Israeli agenda. So there needs to be the empowerment of some Palestinian leadership that fills that void eventually.
Staying with Netanyahu,
go for it, Martin.
Very, very politically aware and clued up on the sensibilities there. Tell us, isn't it not the case that if a ceasefire is brought about by whomever, if a ceasefire is brought about, does that not mean that the momentum that Netanyahu has politically will just collapse overnight? His entire raison d'etre will just grind to a halt and he'll be out.
Possibly. I would say that I would hedge, though, and suggest, first of all, and we're in a new reality, clearly, but prior to October the 7th, Netanyahu was not a militarist leader. He actually was very conservative and cautious when it came to military adventures, unlike some of his predecessors, primarily his immediate predecessor, Prime Minister Olmert, that was very kind of gung-ho, both in war and in peace. Netanyahu is not like that. There is an argument, as you suggest, which is quite possible, that Netanyahu understands that at the end of this war, there will be elections, and he will pay the price with the Israeli electorate. However, he probably looks at it another way. It's not about extending the war or continuating perpetual war for the sake of it. It's about achieving his results. He sets himself and his government very ambitious goals to completely destroy Hamas, to destroy their military capability, and to destroy them as a political power. If he was to succeed in that,
it's not working, Richard. It's not working. You can't come on and tell us that you are destroying Hamas. You're not destroying Hamas. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. How many Hamas people, how many Hamas fighters has the IDF actually killed? You don't know, do you? Because there isn't a figure.
Listen, none of us know. But I would say that according to the IDF, and here we have we have to rely on some verified sources. We've got either the IDF or Hamas, and I'd love for someone to have some form of independent assessment that kind of weighs between the Hamas figures and the IDF figures. But according to what the IDF have been saying, their assessment is that 75% of Hamas fighting force as of October has now been either killed or incapacitated. We're talking about the 24 battalions that were kind of across the whole of the Gaza Strip, that they are pretty much almost all of them, I think 22 or 23 out of 24, have lost their ability of a command and control infrastructure and leadership and command structure that they had in place. That's not to say clearly there are fighters and they're almost returned back to first principles of fighting as individual terror cells. And this is kind of what we're seeing. I give another data point that in Zaytun, in the north of Gaza, IDF soldiers were reporting that they were encountering children firing RPG rockets. Now, on one level, that attests to the fact that the main fighters are no longer there to carry out the attacks. However, that also suggests that the motivation to attack the IDF is very high if children are picking up weapons. This is the dynamic. This is the incredibly difficult dilemma of this war, that you can defeat their command and control structure, but embers of the fire remain, whether it's fighters or members of the population who are now taking up arms.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we do come back, we're going to do a deeper dive into this, but don't go away.
You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers. Me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined by a wonderful panel, Martin J., Dr. George Szamuely, and also Richard Pater. And we're talking about the Middle East and separating the fact from the fiction. And just some statistics which are breaking at the moment. Israel's ordered residents and displaced Palestinians to evacuate the Beit Hanun area of Gaza City, as reports say a large-scale Israeli army operation is expected to begin there soon. The reports so far say there are 3 people are dead and more than 10 wounded in overnight Israeli attacks that destroyed 2 homes and tents sheltering displaced people in central Gaza's Deir el-Balah. What's your take on that, Richard?
I think this is part of a pattern that since the IDF pulled out of northern Gaza, there's been a need for targeted and focused operations to return when they see signs of Hamas reconstituting its fighting force. Again, I've heard one report that even suggested that the factories for building the tunnels has begun operating again in kind of making the cement that are building these slabs, concrete slabs that go into the tunnels. So there are efforts underway to rehabilitate themselves, and that's what these operations are focused at to prevent that from happening.
George?
Well, it's interesting, I mean, because what Richard is saying, that after 10 months, we're back to where we started from. Hamas is reconstituting itself. Hamas has not been defeated, and therefore Israel has to return because Hamas is back and is not defeated. And that's really the problem here, which is that this goal of crushing Hamas, obliterating it, wiping out of existence, is something that can only be achieved ultimately with a whole-scale either decimation of the population of Gaza or the expulsion of the population of Gaza. It cannot be achieved militarily, because as soon as you push them out here, push them out there, then you're back to where you started from, which is that they are starting to reconstitute themselves. But then there's the other issue, which is that even if you have achieved, even if you do destroy Hamas and say, well, good, well, we'll have the Palestinian Authority take power in Gaza. Well, let's assume Palestinian Authority is willing to take part in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is going to ask for something very specific in return, which is you have got to then give us that Palestinian state. You've got to give us that two-state solution. No ands, ifs, and buts. We're not going to do Oslo and all the sort of continuing to build the settlements. We have to have a two-state solution. But now we've had the Israeli Knesset just saying that they've rejected the two-state solution. And Netanyahu openly says he's rejected the two-state solution. Well, if you rejected the two-state solution, there is no way in the world that the Palestinian Authority is going to come in and take over in Gaza.
But that's got to be a fair point, hasn't it, Richard? What are your views on that?
So, I mean, a couple of things to come back on. First of all, unfortunately, even amongst the Israeli left, which have kind of for generations supported a two-state solution, the sad irony of October the 7th is that a lot of those communities that were embellic of that position were the very communities that were attacked and targeted, the kibbutzim on the Gaza periphery. So the peace camp in Israel has physically taken a really serious knock. And conceptually, the idea that October the 7th sadly pushed us further and further away, that Israeli skepticism, even listening to Israeli left-wing leaders, they understand that in order to sell a two-state solution, which they still believe in the future, it needs to be based in kind of the cornerstone of Israeli security. And that's and that's kind of the key message you hear even from Israelis on the left. I would suggest, though, kind of in terms of instead of making the best the enemy of the good, and I accept totally that this is below the threshold of Palestinian requirements and desire, but there must be a way, or that I think that what's being formulated is a way below the threshold of statehood to empower non-Hamas Palestinians to take control. And again, I'll give another example of a plan that is being mooted around here, which is to start a pilot program in the north of the Gaza Strip to take 3,000 to 5,000 Gazan Palestinians who are not affiliated with Hamas, to train them in the same facilities that the US were using in Jordan, for Israel to have oversight and even maybe a veto over certain people if they have the understanding to ensure these are not Hamas, and to bring them back trained to be a civil guard or a civilian police force, which is a Palestinian Authority that can then keep control. And if that pilot works, it can then be put out and spread out. So again, I understand this is not stated. This is below the threshold. That will come hopefully in time. But as a first move, it's about empowering Palestinians on the ground to take control.
Martin?
Yeah, that's a nice idea, isn't it? That's a really nice idea. But when you look at the history, we go back to 2005, where the IDF pulled out of the Gaza Strip, and Hamas emerged. Hamas grew so quickly. So it sprung up from almost nothing as a consequence of that occupation, of a consequence of that conflict. I mean, how is it that we can imagine now that there would be more civilians who are not aligned to Hamas and who want to go along with such programs when there are so many deaths now? I mean, whether we accept the official figures or the Lancet figures of 180,000 deaths, I think it's going to be quite hard to get the numbers, to get a decent number of civilians from Gaza to join such programs. And, so I think Richard mentioned the Gaza being a new Gaza being a cornerstone of security. I think that was the phrase he used. What's interesting about that is that a euphemism for something? Does that mean that we can accept a sort of multicultural, multinational intervention in Gaza. People are talking about the United Arab Emirates. People are talking about American soldiers, even EU police, this sort of thing. Can we accept all this? But is the principle, is the cornerstone, your word, not mine, is the cornerstone of that, is that we have to disarm the Gaza Strip completely so that not one single firearm will be in that area? I'm assuming that's the case, right?
I don't think it's realistic to expect kind of full demilitarization. I think it's about removing Hamas from power. That once Hamas have had their leadership removed or destroyed or surrender, whatever, a combination of which, only then will we start to hear the Hamas voice. The Gazans, the Palestinians living in Gaza, have lived under a totalitarian regime for over a decade and a half. And we should be very concerned and skeptical over any pronouncements that they make whilst Hamas still remain in power and the pronouncements that they make. But I think on a day after, and this is, we have no proof of this, we're not there, but we will find more Gazans coming out critical of Hamas and suggesting an alternate way, an alternate path forward. And only then is the suggestions that you mentioned about international forces, Emiratis, or someone mentioned Indians or Pakistanis that could potentially come in, whether through a UN framework or through another framework of international, well-meaning international community. No one is prepared to do that whilst Hamas remain in power. So the key must be to remove them from power, to understand that they are destined to the dustbin of history, and then empower the combination of local Palestinians and well-meaning international community to rebuild. And that means that rebuilding is in every sense, in terms of the structural rebuilding, but also the institutions of control, so that they no longer pose a threat and can finally start to improve the lives for the Gazan population.
It's interesting that you say that basically both sides are critical of their leaders. You say the Gazans are critical of their leader, Hamas leaders, and Israelis are critical of Netanyahu. I want to talk about the new Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, as the new movement's political chief, who's replaced the assassinated Ismail Haniyeh. Israel's military spokesman, Daniel Hagari, he said in an interview that Israel remains committed to killing Sinwar following news of his elections. What's your take on that, Richard?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's kind of relating back to an earlier comment about the level of success that IDF are having. If the destruction of the leadership kind of, and we've seen Haniyeh targeted, we've seen Al-Awawi targeted as well earlier in the campaign, also based in Beirut. We've seen Marwan Issa and Mohammed Dief. Kind of a whole series of Hamas leaders have already been targeted. This is clearly incredibly difficult because most of them, and we presume that Sinwar is buried deep underground in the labyrinth of tunnels, potentially surrounded by some of the hostages that remain. So the challenge is incredibly complex and difficult. But yes, there's no doubt that he remains kind of the top target. And I think it's here talk about victory pictures, and in the world of kind of images and the giving a sense of victory, having recovering Sinwar's body and kind of declaring officially that he is no longer with us will be a very significant moment in this conflict. Whether we'll get there or not, it's we can only speculate. But it's quite clear that he is kind of a marked man and kind of a high priority target.
And you support that?
I mean, I'm not sure whether I support it or not. Broadly, yes. I mean, it depends at what price. I mean, I have concerns for future deaths of both innocent Israelis and Palestinians, and so it's at what price. I'm not in a position within of any military leadership to have a say. So as a simple citizen, I will watch and assess, and as an analyst, kind of give a perspective. But I don't. I think broadly, yes. I think it would be a good move for world peace if Sinwar was removed. He is an unrepentant murderer, both of Israelis and of fellow Palestinians, and brings nothing to the cause for peace.
Yeah, I'm putting this in perspective when we talk about numbers, and behind each of these numbers, there's a human tragedy. There's at least 39,677 people have been killed and 91,645 wounded in Israel's war on Gaza. I appreciate people sometimes dispute the figures. An estimated 1,139 people were killed.
These are Hamas numbers. Let's be
that's why I say I recognise some people dismiss them. Well, yeah. I don't know the figures. I'm basically working on the information that we've got. Do you have figures yourself? I mean, it's what are the figures you've got?
No, I would say no. I mean, I think the latest number that the IDF quoted was 17,000 Hamas combatants that they believe have been killed, and so that would reflect if the Hamas numbers are accurate. And again, we don't have any way to independently verify. That would suggest kind of a 1-for-1 ratio, almost, which is by urban warfare standards impressive. I mean, I share our shared concerns that it's a tragedy that every civilian non-combatant killed is a tragedy, and there should be. And I'm also confident that the IDF, to a large extent, wherever possible, limits those fatalities, because it's not in Israel's interest to see civilian fatalities. They want to make a clear policy of distinction to target the terrorists, the fighters, the combatants, and to alleviate as much as possible and distance themselves from a civilian population. And of course, what we've seen over the 9 months of fighting is that Hamas takes the inverse approach, that by embedding themselves within a civilian population, there was the classic quote when one of the Gazans complained that civilians don't have access to the tunnels, and they said, "You can go complain to the UN. The tunnels are for fighters." Sums up the attitude of the disregard that the Hamas leadership shows for its own people, and that's really one of the greatest travesties here.
Okay, George.
Well, I'm quite sure that at some point Israel will assassinate Sinwar. I don't think it's going to make very much difference, because the situation is basically irreconcilable. There is no leadership that can ever emerge in Gaza that would be acceptable to Israel. And so, whenever I hear the stories about somehow, well, these are the Palestinians, that they can work with Israel, I always have a feeling of kind of, deja vu all over again. I mean, we used to hear these stories in the 1980s that the PLO did not represent the Palestinians, that Israel was going to work with the local community leaders. Or these are the people. These are the real representatives of the Palestinian people. And then, of course, eventually Israel had to accept that, of course, the PLO did indeed represent the Palestinian people. And then how many times then did Israel then declare, well, we don't have a negotiating partner. There's no one we can't negotiate with. Yasser Arafat is a terrorist. And then again, how many times did Israel attempt to assassinate Yasser Arafat? And indeed, Israel may well have assassinated Yasser Arafat. So, until you can actually resolve the basic issues, and the basic issues, they were outlined at Oslo, and there's the two-state solution. And there's been really no progress towards the two-state solution. And, it's actually creating a viable state. Then you're always going to have, new leaders. Okay, Sinwar's gone. There'll be somebody else. Then that person will be assassinated. Then there'll be somebody else. And this is just going to go on and on and on, this spiral of killing, until you basically resolve the fundamental problem, which is that there has to be a Palestinian state, a serious Palestinian state, not one which is, essentially one part of it is connected to Israel, and then the rest of it is just simply non-viable. And I'm talking about the West Bank. And so that's why, why did Hamas emerge in 2006? Because there's been no progress towards the two-state solution. And they did emerge. I mean, they emerged. They won the election in 2006. They won it in the West Bank as well. It wasn't just in the Gaza. They won in the West Bank because basically the Palestinians were fed up. It had already been 13 years since Oslo, and there'd been no progress. In fact, it had been worse. The settlement building has escalated since the signing of the Oslo Accords. So, can go on assassinating these leaders. You're still not going to stop the killing.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're also going to talk about the reaction from Iran. Don't go away.
Critically analyzing global affairs, the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined by Richard Pater and the usual crowd of Dr. George Szamuely and also Martin Jay. And we're looking at the Middle East and trying to unpack the fact from the fiction and trying to find a way forward. Now, US President Joe Biden, he met his senior national security team in a political climate where many are warning of a possible Iranian retaliatory attack on Israel. Richard, tell me what your thoughts are on Iran. And even President Putin is sort of urging restraint, if you like. They know there's going to be some sort of retaliation. What are your thoughts?
So first of all, I'll kind of give a view from the ground up here in Jerusalem. It's a very surreal time, and not dissimilar to where we were in April, where we see the threats, we see the propaganda videos coming out of the Iranian regime that's kind of pulling these heavy missiles out of the bunkers in preparation for attack, and it's quite disconcerting and disturbing for a civilian population to see this happening in real time. I mean, from the Israeli perspective, it's quite clear that the Iranians have their tentacles all over the region, where they are a source of harnessing further suffering and instability. That the model that the former leader of the IRGC, Soleimani, his goal was to set up a ring of fire surrounding Israel, and as we have now, we have 7 fronts, all of Iranian proxies targeting Israel, from Hamas in the south, from the Houthis in Yemen, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from the militias in Syria and in Iraq, and from Iran itself. So it's quite disconcerting. On the positive side, I would say that just like on April, the 9th of April, the 14th, a coalition came together, including the Brits, the US, and regional partners as well, and helped Israel defend itself. So one hopes that when this imminent attack happens sooner or later, that the international coalition is in place to defend Israel again.
Martin?
A lot of Israeli IDF talking points there, which we need to unpack. It's incredible how, Richard, you've just completely left out all the important nuances of that statement. Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and other people, factions in Iraq, all poised along with the Houthis to hit possibly Israel. Why? Because of the genocide in Gaza. So let's just tackle that, and let's use that word. Is it a genocide? Is that how you see it in Gaza?
Definitely not. No, I don't think so at all. I think that the IDF, and I think again, this agenda for the Iranians started long before October. The ring of fire that they built up, the empowering of their the proxies, particularly the most powerful ones, the Houthis and Hezbollah, are there to threaten Israel. I think it's essentially the long-term game is to protect the Iranians from their nuclear program. If Israel or anyone else were to attack it, Hezbollah are there as the insurance policy. So I think that's a long-standing approach that's got nothing to do with October. And I completely politely, respectfully disagree that there is a genocide. I think if there was any attempt at genocide, then the attempts of the Hamas infiltration to kill women, children, families in their homes on the 7th in the communities inside Israel was the real attempt at genocide, whilst Israel, as I said before, carries out a very clear policy of distinction between armed Hamasniks and a civilian population.
Okay, so to recap then, for you, this conflict started on October the 7th.
No, of course not. No, of course not. This is we're in a longer the conflict itself. We can trace back to the roots in the early part of the 20th century, and a rejection, I think, at its core is a rejection of the principles of Zionism, that the Jews are an authentic part of the region here. And again, if I take a positive swing at this question, one of the most impressive aspects of the Abraham Accords was that for the first time you've got Arab leaders recognizing that the Jews have an authentic role in the region. And so it's not about Jews versus Arab. That's a very dangerous misframing of it. It should be framed as the pragmatists and the moderates against the extremes. And the extremes are represented by Iran and their proxies.
George?
Well, I agree that it's not about Jews and Arabs, because, of course, many Jews around the world do not actually accept the principle that Israel is their state and that they have any real connection with Israel. This was a project conceived by Zionists, by sponsorship of Western governments, to build what was originally called a national homeland for the Jews in what was essentially a British mandate territory. This was not something that was embraced by most Jews in the world, and it still isn't. Most Jews in the world don't live in Israel. And so it's quite right. This isn't about Jews and Arabs. It's about Israel and the Palestinians. It's about this state that was implanted here, displaced the local indigenous population, and then continued to wage wars against its neighbors. You could say the neighbors waged wars against this state, but okay, the neighbors never really accepted it. They never accepted it. They always regarded this as an alien implantation. And then when there were various opportunities, there were many opportunities to resolve this dispute, on something that would have been fairly good terms for Israel, certainly far more generous than was originally envisaged, the Balfour Declaration and the UN partition plan. There were these very generous offers that were made to Israel. Israel, time and again, rejected them. We can go through that. In the Nixon administration, the William Rogers plan. We can talk about NASA's peace offers, and on and on and on. We got the Camp David Accords with the Jimmy Carter. And then, with Oslo, and Israel has repeatedly rejected them. You say, well, why is it repeatedly? Because it basically wants to create this state, essentially, of this greater Israel. And of course, it's a greater Israel. Why did Israel grab those territories, the West Bank and the Gaza? That was the two parts of the original mandatory Palestine that had not been that Israel didn't occupy, and Israel wanted them. They took them, and obviously the goal was to create this greater Israel, because the settlement policy started almost immediately after the 1967 war, contrary to all the UN resolutions, and that's why it makes this any settlement of this conflict almost impossible unless Israel returns to something that would be reasonable and accepted by its neighbors, which is the 1967 borders.
Okay, I do want to focus on, as I say, what the road to peace might look like. Yes, of course you can. That's what I was going to suggest, Richard. Is if you want to pick on a couple of the points that Martin and George said, and then we're going to finish on the road to peace. Go for it.
Sure, thank you. So, I would respectfully disagree that my reading of history is quite different to yours, and in fact, kind of the inverse opposite. That my understanding or assessment would be that Israel, that has constantly been open to reconciliation and peace with its Arab neighbours, and has been rebuffed. And if we take from the 1937 Peel Commission through probably the most significant, the 1947 UN plan that was rejected by the Arab partners, that talked about partition of the land. In 1967, this was a defensive war that Israel fought, having come under attack. You mentioned a NASA peace plan. I would love to hear more about that, because NASA, in terms of the Israeli narrative, has only been about destroying Israel. Israel, in fact, tried to prevent the Jordanians getting involved in 67 and sent emissaries there. Only after the Jordanians sent mortars not far from here, actually, over the other side of the seam line, did Israel then take over the West Bank. Again, we then have the idea that this was the settlement there came from indigenous. This was not Israeli government policy. Israel was being led by a Labour left-wing government. These were a groundswell of Jews that connected to the heartland of Israeli and Jewish civilization in the West Bank. And the challenge, to cut a long story short, the challenge we are all left with now, those that seek peace, is to how you find a reconciliation of two legitimate national movements, the Zionists and of the Jews and the Palestinians, and how you build it. And your solution of kind of finding 67 lines with potential modifications, I agree is the way forward. But we're much further away from there. But I don't think it's fair to categorically blame Israel for all of that. I mean, I think there's enough misery that both sides are to blame, and bad decisions have been made. But the essence that Israel has sought to find accommodation with its Arab partners and to essentially have the hand outstretched to peace in principle over many, many decades.
So in a nutshell, Richard, would you support an immediate ceasefire?
I would support a ceasefire that led to the return of all the hostages. I think the hostages for Israeli society is an open wound. I mean, again, I think the Israeli government let down their people on October the 7th, and the very kind of basis of a social contract was broken when people had their homes invaded and were either killed or taken captive. It is the first order of business to return the captives. If the captives were returned, if a ceasefire involved a Hamas ceasefire and a repositioning of power to another entity, another Palestinian entity, then yes, ceasefire is great. Anything that can stop the fighting should be supported.
Okay, very, very interesting, because that's contrary again to what Netanyahu's saying. He's saying they basically have to be eliminated before you even have the discussion. I want to then focus on George. First of all, there were a couple of points that Richard raised, which he questioned your summary. Do you want to come back to him on those?
Well, obviously, the question was, we go back to the UN partition plan. There's no evidence that Israel ever accepted the UN partition plan. They knew that the Arabs would not accept it, and so they pretended that they had accepted it. They didn't accept the partition plan, and that is why they always coveted those territories that was occupied by Arabs after the 1948 war. The story of the 1967, that this was an attack on Israel, is just nobody in Israel seriously takes that. I mean, that's just absurd. I mean, even historians like Benny Morris kind of rejected. Of course, it was an act of war by Israel. Israel launched that war. Clearly, Nasser was caught by surprise. He didn't know what was coming. That's why he hadn't made no preparations for that war. And the goal always was to seize those two pieces of territory that was part of the British mandatory Palestine in order to create this greater Israel. Nasser made very generous offers after the 67 war, which was basically return to the status quo ante and a settlement of the refugee problem. And the settlement of the refugee problem had been an ongoing thing. There were United Nations General Assembly resolutions demanding a settlement of the refugee problem. That was Nasser's peace plan. And then, of course, all the rest of it, which were clearly involved Israel returning to the 67 borders. That was a simple plan. But once the issue of the settlements was clearly what the key hindrance, and of course it was sponsored by the governments. I mean, again, there's no point in denying that. Even Israelis don't deny it. Of course, it was the government. Yes, you said it was a kind of leftish government. They offered Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, but they were sponsoring. They were financing the settlement, and it was done with a view to essentially that you're going to build these settlements. You're going to integrate this within Israel to the point when it simply will become impossible to break the settlements.
Okay. Last few minutes available to us. I do want your sort of take on a potential solution for the region. I appreciate it's a massive subject, but Martin, if you can give me your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I'm listening to Richard. I really feel strongly that the big problem we've got here is that no one trusts Israel anymore. And they always take the high moral ground. They always have the moral tutelage to dish out in great quantities. But whether you talk about George's reference to 1947 or 67 war, which Israel started under what today we call false flag attacks, or even post 2005, and even today, the idea of Israel talking peace, talking for a ceasefire with Hamas, when you're still slaughtering so many people, so many thousands of people every day in a genocide. You're still killing the leaders. How do you negotiate with an organization whose leaders you're killing every single day? That doesn't seem to be very genuine. It seems to be actually quite delusional. Actually, I don't think Israel has the high moral ground at all. And this is part of the problem, is it's not taken seriously, and people just simply don't trust it. And some of the things which have shocked me recently, when we talk about this morality that Israel seems to cling to, which shocks me, really does shock me. We have statements from a government minister the other day saying that, we could happily justify killing 2 million Gazans, but the rest of the world wouldn't let us. When you hear that from a government minister, and on the same day or the next day you read that the Israeli government have basically stolen $26 million of tax receipts, which are supposed to be given over to the government in Gaza, and said, no, we're going to take this money and give it to the victims of October the 7th. These things are frankly disgusting. They're repugnant, and they don't really shine a very favorable spotlight on Israel. And Israel is now being shunned and boycotted, and the sanctions are just unprecedented around the world. Its economy is being beaten to pulp. That you wonder really, what is the long game here for Israel? What is really, how does Netanyahu get out of this? And and continues when the military is stretched to such extraordinary lengths. I'd really like to hear Richard's take on all this. Does he really believe that Israel has a high moral ground?
Well, I think let's finish on that then, because as Richard says, not all Israelis support Netanyahu, and once this war has finished, and hopefully will finish, then Netanyahu's got all sorts of questions. 30 seconds, Richard. What is the road to peace, and what's your take on what Martin said?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but let me just try and be as brief as possible. I think peace comes when both sides can reconcile the existence of the other. And as I said, for me, the key boundary is Palestinian acceptance that the Jews are an authentic part of this region, and that they deserve self-determination like all the other peoples, of course, including the Palestinians. And that mutual respect and reconciliation is the way forward. And you build that by a coalition of the willing, a coalition of the pragmatists. We've seen it when Israel has made peace with the Egyptians and the Jordanians, with the Abraham Accord. Prior to October, the big talk was about the Saudis. And so hopefully there is that alignment of the moderates to face against the extremists is the way forward.
Okay. We will continue this discussion. I thought it was a very productive discussion. There's lots to unpack. Richard, Peter, Martin, and George, thank you both very much. I'll be back with you same time, same place tomorrow. Join us there.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at tntradio.live.